Theoretical frameworks should not be added to a study as a requirement to satisfy structure. They should emerge from the logic of the problem itself. When phenomenon, tension, and consequence are clearly articulated, the pathway to theory becomes visible and defensible. To make that pathway explicit, it is necessary to walk through the complete alignment chain. That chain is phenomenon, tension, consequence, theory, constructs derived from that theory, variables or forms of evidence representing those constructs, measures or data sources that capture those variables, and finally, what the theory allows you to interpret in your findings. Begin again with the AI and independence example. The phenomenon is that AI can function as a scaffold for independence in learners with autism and dyslexia. The tension is that current accommodations provide support, but may not build autonomy or internal skill ownership. The consequence is increased anxiety and long-term reliance when independence is not intentionally developed. Suppose self-determination theory is considered as a potential theoretical framework. This theory explains how autonomy support, competence, and relatedness influence intrinsic motivation and psychological well-being. Before selecting it, the alignment must be tested directly. The tension asserts that autonomy is not developing under current systems. Therefore, the selected theory must explain how autonomy develops, how it is supported, and what occurs when it is not supported. Self-determination theory explicitly addresses autonomy as a psychological need and explains the consequences of its satisfaction or frustration. The consequence involves long-term anxiety and reliance. The theory must therefore account for psychological outcomes over time. Self-determination theory links autonomy support to motivation and well-being, providing a mechanism connecting instructional patterns to emotional outcomes. At this point, the theory explains both the tension and the consequence. From this theory, central constructs include autonomy support, perceived competence, and intrinsic motivation. These constructs are not arbitrarily selected. They are derived directly from the theoretical model. If the study is quantitative, variables might include perceived autonomy support from instructional tools, levels of intrinsic motivation during academic tasks, and observed indicators of independent task initiation. Measures might include validated autonomy and motivation scales, along with structured behavioral observations. The full alignment chain is now visible. The phenomenon identifies the domain. The tension identifies a breakdown in autonomy development. The consequence identifies long-term psychological impact. The theory explains the mechanism connecting autonomy support to well-being. The constructs derive from the theory. The variables represent those constructs. The measures capture those variables. Findings can then be interpreted through the explanatory model provided by the theory. Now consider a theory that shares surface features with the phenomenon, but does not explain the mechanism embedded in the tension. A general technology adoption theory may appear aligned because the study involves AI. From that theory, constructs might include perceived usefulness, ease of use, and institutional readiness. Variables might include satisfaction ratings and frequency of platform use. Measures might include surveys and usage analytics. The break occurs between the tension and the theory. The tension concerns autonomy development and long-term reliance. The selected theory explains adoption behavior rather than autonomy formation. The constructs do not represent the tension. The variables do not capture the consequence. Although the phenomenon involves AI, the theory does not explain the mechanism that matters. Now examine a subtler case. Suppose a narrowly instructional scaffolding theory is selected. This theory explains how support is gradually faded during tasks and how learners internalize strategies. At the tension level, this theory may align. It explains how autonomy can be built through structured fading of supports. However, if the consequence in the problem statement emphasizes long-term anxiety extending into adulthood, the theory must also account for psychological development across time. If the scaffolding theory does not address emotional or motivational outcomes, the break occurs at the consequence level. The theory explains the instructional process but does not fully explain the long-term psychological impact claimed in the problem. Alignment fails between theory and consequence. Now shift the tension while holding the phenomenon constant. Suppose the phenomenon remains AI as a scaffold, but the tension concerns inconsistent performance outcomes across learners. The consequence is widening achievement gaps based on prior knowledge. This tension identifies a different mechanism. The issue becomes differential cognitive processing rather than autonomy development. Cognitive load theory becomes a plausible framework because it explains how intrinsic and extraneous load influence performance. From cognitive load theory, constructs include intrinsic load, extraneous load, and germane load. Variables might include performance accuracy, task completion time, and self-reported cognitive effort. Measures might include performance tasks and validated cognitive load scales. The alignment holds because the tension involves cognitive processing differences, and the theory explains how those differences influence outcomes. Changing the tension changes the required explanatory mechanism. The theory shifts accordingly. Scope alignment must also be evaluated. If the consequence operates at a developmental or psychological level, the theory must operate at that same level. If the consequence is confined to short-term classroom engagement, selecting a broad lifespan developmental theory may introduce unnecessary abstraction. The level of explanation must match the level of consequence. Construct alignment is another critical checkpoint. Once a theoretical framework is selected, it constrains which constructs are central. Constructs introduced in the study should be traceable to the theoretical framework or explicitly integrated into a broader conceptual model. When constructs appear without theoretical grounding, alignment weakens. It is important to distinguish between theory, theoretical framework, and conceptual framework. A theory is an established explanation of how or why something occurs. It contains defined constructs and proposed relationships among them. A theoretical framework is the specific theory selected to anchor the study. It explains the mechanism embedded in the tension and consequence and guides construct selection and interpretation. A conceptual framework is the study-specific representation of key concepts and their relationships within the design. For example, if self-determination theory serves as the theoretical framework, the conceptual framework might map AI scaffolding, autonomy support, intrinsic motivation, and independence within the context of the study. The theory explains. The conceptual framework organizes. To test alignment, articulate the full chain explicitly. This phenomenon exists. This tension identifies a breakdown. This consequence explains why it matters. This theory explains the mechanism connecting the tension to the consequence. These constructs derive from that theory. These variables represent those constructs. These measures capture those variables. These findings will be interpreted through that theoretical lens. If any link in that chain cannot be explained clearly, alignment is incomplete. If the theory does not meaningfully shape interpretation of findings, it functions decoratively rather than explanatorily. If removing the theory does not weaken the explanation of the problem, the framework is not yet functioning as an explanatory backbone. When the alignment chain is fully visible and each breakpoint is identifiable, theory selection becomes a structured reasoning process grounded in the problem itself. Phenomenon, tension, and consequence do not simply introduce the study. They direct the selection of a theoretical framework that is coherent, defensible, and conceptually aligned.